Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks to the Environmental Pillar for hosting this debate on the very important topic of the environment and the role of the EU, specifically the role of the European Parliament. At the outset, could I say just my apologies. I did signal in advance to the organisers that I will have to leave at 3 o'clock. So I hope that I'll be able to deal with as many of the questions and issues that you have within the next hour. I suppose maybe just to start off with my own engagement. I was asked to start off with my own engagement in environmental issues and what I would hope to achieve as an MEP. And the first thing that I would say is that maybe I became very sensitized to the environment when one of my first jobs after graduation was as a FOSS supervisor on a project with the Irish Wildlife Federation, where we did a survey of derelict sites within the inner city. And I have to say that Frank, your book at the time, The Destruction of Dublin, was probably one of our Bibles, and we mapped all of the inner city sites, all of the open spaces within the inner city. We looked at the flora and the fauna of those sites, and we came up with recommendations that could have possible community or biodiversity uses for some of those sites. But unfortunately, the then government designated most of them tax incentive sites, where they went on to build cheap and cheerful apartments, and we know the legacy that that has left us with. So I suppose I have been particularly sensitized to environmental matters from my whole experience with the Irish Wildlife Federation. Moving on then as Lord Mayor of Dublin, I was very much party to the, I'm told to hold the mic back, I was very much party to the Covenant of Mayors that came up with the plan to make Dublin an energy smart city. And I was very involved in that, and at European level as well in my year as Lord Mayor. Incidentally, I campaigned for a biodiversity office with Dublin City Council. More recently then in the European Parliament, I'm not in the Environment Committee, but I have taken an interest in environmental issues. I was the rapporteur on a food poverty programme called Fund for Aid to the Most Deprived, and what I did was I tried to link that particular programme with the issues around food donations, to link it with food donations to prevent food waste, and as a result of my work on that, I was invited to become co-chair of the Sustainable Food Steering Group in the European Parliament, also looking at healthy food options, local supply chains. In relation to work of coming up through the Environmental Committee, I worked specifically on the issue of biofuels, worked very closely with Oxfam, Trócaire, ActionAid Sierra Leone partnership to highlight the negative impact of current EU policies on biofuels, and I campaigned very strongly for the 5.5% limit on biofuels. Like I would have liked, like the other organisations, to have seen it even at 10%. What we agreed in the end was the 5.5% limit on agriculture use of biofuels. But I think that it was a compromise, but it has highlighted the issue, and certainly looking for second generation fuels to be used. I've also worked on emissions, and just to say that I've got 100% very good assessment by the Climate Action Network, and I'm the only Irish MEP to have 100% score from them on environmental issues. Okay, yeah, thank you for that. I think that the first thing that we need to focus on is the actual implementation of existing EU law. There's a lot of very good law there. There are a lot of very good directives there. And failure to respect these laws, it has been estimated, would actually cost Europe 30 billion euro in environmental and health costs over the next 30 years. So implementation has to be key. And very often we see that we go after the implementation of equality in terms of women's rights, in terms of workers' rights. I think we have to be very forceful on environmental issues. I think that implementation of EU environmental law probably has improved a little bit, and this is sometimes more due to fear of EU fines than it is a willingness to be there. But again, I would welcome the fact that the government has recently ratified the Aarhus Convention, and I think that this will make transparency in these areas much better. I think that one of the areas that I think we would like to focus on would be the Environmental Impact Assessment Directive. That was passed by the European Parliament in March of this year. It has to be transposed into legislation by May 2017. Now, I would dearly like to see the government actually transpose that early, and I think that we should push for that. Other areas are the European Environmental Action Programme for 2014-20. That is actually quite a good document, and I think that if we could work towards that, the implementation there, it would be something that would be good. There are lots of kind of very good areas, particularly in waste management, chemicals, energy and climate change. Food waste, I mentioned to you my role in that. In June, the Commission is due to come forward with a sustainable food communication, which will deal with also with the issue of food waste, and that's something that I would like to be involved in as well. So I think that there's a huge body of work. There's a major priority there for the next European Parliament, and as somebody who has worked to promote and develop the environment and is concerned about Dublin's environment, I would be very happy to work with environmental groups in relation to all of these issues. First of all, I think that it is really important that we see the EU regain the initiative and take leadership in relation to the whole issue of global climate change. And I would really like to see the European Union take the lead in the development of the new global climate agreement in Paris by the end of 2015. I think too that it's important that we have some joined up thinking within the European Union as well, because I don't think that we can break things into silos and put environmental issues into one silo while we're looking at development or humanitarian considerations in others. And one of the main achievements of the Irish presidency last year, one of the main achievements of the Irish presidency was that they tried to bring this cohesiveness in policies, where there were meetings between the Environment Commissioner, Potocnik, the Development Commissioner, Peebags, and the Humanitarian Commissioner, Georgieva, to come up with a comprehensive and a global policy. In relation to emissions, certainly I would. The answer is very straightforward, yes, I would support the 55%. Our group in the European Parliament the last time did argue for a 50% emissions, and at the time I think that what happened was that there was a compromise amendment that all groups and parties supported for 40% for the 2030 framework, because that was what was realistic, it seemed to be realistic at the time. But I think that it is important that we do go back to the Parliament and we do and that we do push that again. So I would support 55%. I would support the 55% reduction. I would also support the 40% in energy efficiency and 40% in renewable share. But unfortunately, as I say, compromises are sometimes done in the European Parliament, but I think it is worth going back to have another bite. Just maybe if I could briefly return to the previous question, because there were certain things stated, sorry, I keep doing that. There were certain things stated that I just wanted to have a quick response to. This government has for the first time introduced climate change legislation, and I would say that this was something that was significant and that it was important, and that the previous government didn't manage to succeed in doing despite commitments that were there. And this climate change legislation, it's not true to say that it has no binding targets, because what the climate change legislation says is that it will agree to be bound by the targets that are set by the EU. And there will be targets set by the EU by the end of 2015. So this is the first time, and Ireland will be one of the first EU countries to introduce comprehensive climate change legislation. And I do think that it is important to say that it was a priority of Labour in government, and it is something that does need to be responded to. In relation to biodiversity, I completely agree with what has been said, that we need to do something to halt the rapid decline of biodiversity. I outlined my own involvement in the Irish Wildlife Federation and in the look at open spaces in the city, and how much of the biodiversity was destroyed in the development of those. So I think that we need to do a lot to try and maintain and keep our green spaces. And I did lobby for Dublin City Council to appoint a biodiversity officer. I was very pleased when back in 2005 that actually took place. There was a report in 2012 in the Parliament on biodiversity, and I would very much support its findings. 25% of all species in Europe are under threat. Only a sixth of habitats are in favourable condition, and 75% of fish stocks have been overfished. So I think that it is important, and one of the areas that we can do in the next Parliament is that the Environmental Action Plan, we need legislation on foot of the Environmental Action Plan. sometimes I've heard the inverse argument made, and that is that because we need growth and because we need jobs and we need to combat poverty, that we really have to put climate change on ice until we actually deal with that. So I think it's interesting to turn that argument completely on its head, which is what the climate change skeptics do. And I think that this comes back to the whole issue of climate justice. And again, it goes back to the issue that I referred to earlier about not putting things into silos. And you can't say, you know, well, we'll sort of deal with environmental issues there and we'll deal with development issues there, because we know that the impact of climate change impacts mostly on the most vulnerable, on the poorest, and the member states, or on the nation states that can least afford to deal with the matter. So I think that we need a global response to climate change. Yes, I do believe that we need economic growth still, and I don't think that we have arrived at a stage where we can have a steady state, because what we have to be able to do is that we have to be able to combat poverty. But at the same time, we need to ensure that what we do is not imposing worse conditions and worse poverty on certain parts of the world, while at the same time we're interested in developing the Western economies, and that's the challenge for us. First of all, on looking at the strategic environmental impact assessment, and this is an issue that I was actually looking at to see what could be done, and just in relation to the Commission's response to this, they have said that Article 3 and Article 3.2 of the directive say that an environmental assessment, I'm doing this again, that the Strategic Environmental Impact Assessment Directive relates to the assessment of plans and programmes rather than individual projects. Now, that said, that there is Article 3.1 and Article 3.2 of that directive say that an environmental assessment must be carried out for plans and programmes, particularly those in relation to energy. The Energy Impact Assessment Directive, which has been passed, and it actually took effect yesterday, I'm not sure if you're aware of that, and it's the one I referred to earlier that must be now transposed by 2017, provides for a de facto environmental impact assessment on all fracking projects. And what that did was that it prevented completely any kind of project splitting, so that you couldn't get the project splitting, so that an environmental assessment will be needed. I just want to add to that Pat Rabbitte, as Minister, has launched an assessment of, has funded an assessment of fracking, and there will be no fracking licences even contemplated, not even contemplated or applied for, until that assessment has been completed, and that's the government's position at the moment. I am really sorry that I am going to have to leave. I just want to say, just in relation to the TTIP question that's coming up, that certainly I will not be supporting that under any circumstances. I do have major issues around these ISDAs, and similarly, and my group has problems with them. Similarly to the way that I opposed ACTA, I have voted against the anti-counterfeiting trade agreement. I will not support this if these issues are not fully resolved.
Thank you very much, Emer. And I think, can we give Emer a round of applause, seeing as she has to go. Thank you, and the best.